I'm delighted to introduce to our next speaker, David Lorimer. David is a prolific writer and lecturer. He's quite famous, and is the program director of the Scientific and Medical Network, amongst other things. He's authored and edited numerous books, including The Spirit of Science. And David is going to speak to us on what is possibly the most pressing issue of our day, living in harmony with the earth. David, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction, Stephen. And it's very good to be with you, some old friends I haven't seen for quite some time. And I appreciate the invitation to speak to you about living in harmony with nature. I've got a few beautiful Taoist type images through my presentation. This is the first one, which is a sort of contemplative. You can see the water and the person in the small boat, and just a sense of peace in the landscape. I'm going to start with the Tao Te Ching. This is a new translation, which you may be able to see here, of the Tao Te Ching by the Divine Feminine Tao Te Ching by Rosemary Anderson. And this is number 8. The highest good is like water, bringing goodness to all things without struggle. In seeking low places spurned by others, the Tao resembles water. And it continues, for a house, the good is the land. For the mind, the good is depth. And so that one's always trying to get back to this primal condition of the uncarved block, undyed silk, and nothing to excess, of Wu Wei, which is acting without acting. As you will know, Thanksgiving is coming up in the US this week, and there's a new take on this in this wonderful book, Braiding Sweetgrass, which I'm going to talk a little bit about, by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And she said we shouldn't be giving our allegiance to the flag. We should be giving our allegiance to gratitude, which is what Thanksgiving is all about, surely. And this is a ceremony that is done in 3rd grade with children in school. And it reads like this: today we have gathered, and when we look upon the faces around us, we see that the cycles of life continue. We have been given the duty to live in balance, in harmony with each other and all living things. So now let us bring our minds together as one, as we give greetings and thanks to each other as people. Now our minds are one. And this is a sentiment that has been echoed by the previous speakers, that we need to come together at a different level. So as I'm going to say a little bit about this book as context, but let me start with this story, which I was quite struck by. And it is that a Carol Crow was an indigenous ecologist, and she wanted to go to a conference on sustainability. And so she had to go and get funding from her elders. And so she was asked, well, what is this notion of sustainability? What are they talking about? So she gave them some standard definitions, such as the management of natural resources and social institutions in such a manner as to ensure the attainment and continued satisfaction of human needs for present and future generations. And the elders fell quiet for a moment. And then one elder said, this sustainable development sounds to me like they just want to keep on taking, like they always have. It's always about taking. You go there and tell them that in our way, our first thoughts are not what can we take, but what can we give to Mother Earth? That's how it's supposed to be. And I think that's an incredibly powerful statement, especially after COP26 and whatever you think about it and its outcome, because the analysis is simply not deep enough. We need a wholesale, radical revamping of our worldview, going back to the principles of indigenous wisdom. And that's what I'm going to be arguing today. And as Sarah and Peter have already said, we are at a precarious point in our evolution. And there's nothing to suggest necessarily that Western civilization, as we know it, won't decay and collapse in the same way as every other civilization before it. And the notion of progress is arguably an illusion, unless it is progress in fundamentals, which is spiritual progress, according to Albert Schweitzer. In 1941, Aldous Huxley said technological progress has merely provided us with a more efficient means of going backwards. You might find that rather startling, but I think what if you start to think what is real progress, and progress is progress in spirituality, progress in humanity, what it means to be deeply humane. That is the real progress and what we ought to be focusing on, rather than simply on technological progress. So we're in a situation where we may need to break down in order to break through. And as Sarah was suggesting, we've created a massive evolutionary challenge by the situation in which we've found ourselves. And the way we're going about trying to, quote, solve it is really just tinkering with the symptoms and rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. So I think, as Capra and others have said, we have a crisis of perception. And here is Philip Sherrard in a very powerful book from the late 1990s, where he says we're treating our planet in an inhuman, God-forsaken manner because we see things in an inhuman, God-forsaken way. And we see things in this way because that basically is how we see ourselves. And likewise, Gregory Bateson said that the major problems in the world are the result of the difference between the way nature works and the way man thinks. This is absolutely fundamental. We need to understand this at the world leadership level, but they just don't understand this at all. They think that capitalism, economic growth, linear thinking can just go on as usual. Now here is Syed Hossein Nasser, and he wrote this very, very powerful book in 1967. Okay, so going back a very long way, called Man and Nature. There's a major crisis at hand. It must be taken completely seriously. We must also realize that environmental crisis cannot be solved by good engineering or better engineering, and though the engineering metaphor is a mechanistic one, or economic planning or cosmetic changes in our conception of development and change. It requires a very radical transformation in our consciousness. And this means not discovering a completely new state of consciousness, but returning to the state of consciousness which traditional humanity always had. It means to rediscover the traditional way of looking at the world of nature as sacred presence. And you can understand why I've emphasized that. It means to rediscover the traditional way of looking at the world of nature as sacred presence. And Nasser, he continues in the same book, nothing is more dangerous in the current ecological debate than the scientific view of man and nature, which cuts man off from his spiritual roots and takes a desacralized nature for granted, while expanding its physical boundaries by billions of light years. This view destroys the reality of the spiritual world while speaking of awe before the grandeur of the cosmos. So the desacralization process through materialism reduces the world to flatland, where it's supposed that there is only the physical dimension, and we can exploit that physical dimension for our own ends. Schumacher, famous for his Buddhist economics, said that modern man, humans, do not experience themselves as part of nature, but as an outside force to dominate and conquer it. He even talks of a battle with nature, forgetting that if he won the battle, he'd find himself on the losing side. It's a brilliant remark. And so anything that starts with the war against is really a disaster. It's the wrong way of approaching things. We have the war against cancer, for instance, and we're trying to fight a war against the virus at the moment. And this is just not the way of going about things. And he also said, which I think is one of his great sayings, that we're now too clever to survive without wisdom. So here are some ways in which nature has been understood in terms of metaphors. In the medieval period, we had the world soul, and this is the indigenous view as well. The world is animate, the world is sacred. And then we had the view of the world as an organism. It's quite related to the world soul, held by the Renaissance philosophers and more recently by biologist Brian Goodwin. And then we have the dominating metaphor, which is disastrous in its consequences, of mechanism. And so the human being is thought to be a mechanism. Cells are machines, animals are machines, humans are machines, said Jacques Monod, Nobel Prize-winning biologist. And this originates in the thinking of Galileo, Descartes, and Newton. But it has to be replaced by the web of life, the Capra and Luisi systems theory, the web of life, interconnectedness, interdependence, and recognizing that we are part of this. Another articulation of this you find in Gaia theory with Jim Lovelock and Lynn Margulis, and that, that we are part of the larger Earth system. We're not separate from it. And so in indigenous terms, we belong to the Earth. The Earth does not belong to us. So here are some indigenous principles which I've taken from Braiding Sweetgrass, which I'm in the process of reviewing at the moment. So they're reciprocity, mutuality, relationship, care, because we are in a relationship, partnership, kinship, belonging, and flourishing has to be mutual. We can't flourish if the earth does not flourish. We can't flourish if plants don't flourish. We can't flourish if animals can't flourish. And then we have abundance and generosity and giving, which leads to sharing the abundance. And we have the notion of the honorable harvest, which I found very, very powerful. Let me read you the principles of the honorable harvest from this book. Know the ways of the ones who take care of you so that you may take care of them. Introduce yourself, be accountable as the one who comes asking for life. Ask permission before taking, abide by the answer. Never take the first, never take the last. Take only what you need, take only that which is given. Never take more than half, leave some for others. Harvest in a way that minimizes harm. Use it respectively, never waste what you have taken. Share, give thanks for what you have been given. Give a gift in reciprocity for what you have taken. Sustain the ones who sustain you, and the earth will last forever. So the plants in the indigenous language are those who take care of us. We should remember this. And this is embodied in ceremonies. And we've lost this sense of ceremony. Peter talked about the cycles and the festivals, which we've rather lost sight of. But I think we must rediscover these and really enact them in order, as part of the way in which we can recover our relationship with nature. And so we have these harvest festivals in the church, for instance, and Thanksgiving. If the people in the US, our brothers and sisters in the US, really reflected on Thanksgiving from the point of view of real gratitude, not just that you were given the land, and we know the history and the marginalization and extermination of the indigenous peoples. And so there should be an awareness of this and the realization that we need to return to what the indigenous people call the original instructions. So what we're really we're dominated by what Ian McGilchrist talks or refers to as left hemisphere thinking, and his new book, The Matter with Things, has just come out. It's 5,700 references. It's one of the great books of our time, if you can make time to read it. That is, I'm on page 400 at the moment, but it's an extraordinary book. And one of the reasons that this idea of controlling nature emerged was as a result of the Black Death. And you can understand that when a third of the population of Europe was wiped out in the 14th century, that you really want to try and get control of the process. But what this has led to is this mechanistic, instrumental way of thinking, where people are just means to an end. And it's correlated with our existing capitalist system and resource exploitation of people as well. And it corresponds to what Schumacher called a science of manipulation. So look at the language: genetic engineering, manipulation, upgrading the software. And they're all ways of speaking that are not an I-thou relationship. They're an I-it relationship, and it can be manipulated and exploited. So we have a corresponding economics of exploitation and exhaustion. And just to think that by reducing our carbon emissions, we can, as it were, solve the problem, completely ignores the large context, the terrain, in terms of the Pasteur-Béchamp debate. And the terrain is the entire system. It's not just the CO2 in the atmosphere. Where was the talk of fish stocks? Where was the talk of soil in a soil depletion in Glasgow? We need to be looking at all of these things. So it's embedded in short-term thinking and the priority of money and power. And you can see these things in a polarity between the approach of Bill Gates, who is trying to take over the whole food system as well as the medical system, which he already has, and Vandana Shiva, who is on the side of biodiversity, life, seeds, renewal. And that she's got a recent book that's just come out on Gates, which I'm waiting to receive. And here's Fritjof Capra, again, making the same point, that instead of being machine, nature at large turns out to be more like human nature, unpredictable, sensitive to the surrounding world, influenced by small fluctuations, which we're beginning to understand. Accordingly, he says, the appropriate way of approaching nature to learn about her complexity and beauty is not through domination and control, but through respect, cooperation, and dialogue. In other words, through the indigenous way, not through modern technological maximization of yield. And here is Wendell Berry, the famous poet and farmer. And he says, our system of agriculture, by modeling itself on economics rather than biology, agribusiness, and I'll go into some detail about this, thus removes food from the cycle of production and puts it into a finite linear process that in effect destroys it by transforming it into waste. So it's a linear one-way process. So it transforms food into fuel. We just talk about calories rather than nutrients, a form of energy that's usable only once. And in doing so, transforms the body into a consumptive machine. So the body is regarded as a machine within this system. And he continues in relation to soil, where the damages of our present agriculture all come from the determination to use the life of the soil as if it were an extractable resource like coal. This couldn't be more important at this point, to use living things as if they were machines, to impose scientific, that is laboratory exactitude upon living complexities that are ultimately mysterious. And you probably know that meat production is now computerized, and you get a chicken in 42 days, or you have these animal feed operations where the amount of food is calculated on a computer, and you're literally treating the animal or the bird as a machine for putting on weight, and then to be slaughtered and eaten by us. Living complexities that are ultimately mysterious in modern agriculture. The machine metaphor is allowed to usurp and wipe from consideration not merely some values, but the very issue of value. And that's an extremely important point. And I just put in parentheses here, I'm not going to say much about him, the work of Viktor Schauberger. Some of you on water and forest, some of you will know his work. And he said in German, what we have to do in relation to nature is kapieren, which is to understand, and kopieren, which is to copy. So this is biomimicry, imitation of nature, understanding nature. And it's a 180-degree turn from where we are at the moment, and applies to water and agriculture. And we can see this in the development of biodynamics with Steiner and in biomimicry. And these next two slides are a chart where you can see the contrast between the agro-industry and agroecological approach. So we have the machine metaphor as opposed to the cycle of life, the manipulation of nature rather than working in harmony with nature, competition rather than participation, economics as primary rather than ecology as primary, linear thinking rather than systems thinking, progress rather than sustainability, quantity in terms of yield, maximizing quantity, as opposed to quality in terms of nutrients. Monoculture imposed on the biodiversity of life. And note that this involves herbicides, pesticides, and so forth, which is effectively biocide, which is killing life. And so our modern agriculture is based on killing other things that are not consistent with the monoculture. And just this morning, I was on my walk, and a big agricultural machine had been round, cutting some branches and hedges and things, and they just mangle it. They just mangle it. It's violence applied to the landscape. And you see this with hedges around everywhere now, because it's more economical to use a big machine than to cut the hedge with love. It's horrendous. And this involves waste rather than recycling. It's a global system rather than local, and it creates dependency rather than fostering self-sufficiency. So the links here, and I'm going to go into that a little bit more in a moment, are between holistic science, sustainable agriculture, and integrated health. And I explain this in my book about the Prince of Wales, Radical Prince, the links between this holistic approach to science, sustainable or agroecological approach to growing our food, and integrated health. And I'm going to come on to Sir Albert Howard in a moment. And this means nature has to be regarded as sacred, and therefore we work in harmony with nature. And it means that we have to limit the way that we currently use science in terms of manipulation, control, and exploitation. And the reverence for life of Albert Schweitzer would give us a completely different set of values. And this is really where the key is, values and relationships, because if we have a relationship with nature in terms of reciprocity, mutuality, and so forth, then that brings in, as I say, a different set of values. And so this is Wendell Berry: value and technology can only meet on the ground of restraint. And we think we can just go around about things unrestrained. When in fact, the situation we're in at the moment is that the earth and ourselves as well, and many living beings are in need of healing and regeneration. So the Prince of Wales also says that there's a sacred trust between the humans and our creator, under which we accept the duty of stewardship for the earth. And I know some people are uneasy about this notion of stewardship, which implies management. And so I think there is a limitation to this metaphor. And it's been an important feature of religious and spiritual thought. So if we're to achieve genuinely sustainable development, he says, we must rediscover a sense of the sacred in our dealings with the natural world and each other. And I think I'm not sure where he is exactly at the moment in terms of this, because he seems to be supporting the Great Reset of Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum, and Prince William with his wonderful Earthshot initiative talks about repairing the earth. And so I wrote to HRH's office and said, to repair something is a machine. You don't repair the earth, you restore and regenerate and heal the earth. I don't know whether that message has got through. So here is Sir Albert Howard, who was the great agriculturalist in India, who was really at the root of the development of the Soil Association and organic agriculture and agroecology. So this is from his book, An Agricultural Testament, published in 1940. The birthright of all living things is health, he writes. This law is true for soil, plant, animal, and man. The health of these four is one connected chain. Note that, one connected chain. We can't have an unhealthy soil, then have healthy plants, animals, or humans. Any weakness or defect in the health of any earlier link in the chain is carried on to the next and succeeding links until it reaches the last, namely man. 4, the widespread vegetable, animal pests and diseases, which are such a bane to modern agriculture, are evidence of a great failure of health in the second, plant, and the third, animal links of the chain. And he said that pests are nature's professors of agriculture. In other words, You have to strengthen the plant rather than destroy the pest. The impaired health of human populations in modern civilized countries is a consequence of this failure in the second and third links, plant and animal, and of course stress and various other factors as well. This general failure in the last three links is to be attributed to a failure in the first link, the soil. The undernourishment of the soil is at the root of all. And this is an incredibly important point. It's why the Soil Association actually exists. Now, I want to apply this to our current situation, and this, I realize this is a controversial viewpoint, a controversial subject, and that people have very different views, partly depending on what sources of information are available to them. And so I think that the situation we're in at the moment is, as it were, a paradigm war between natural and complementary approaches to health and agriculture and science, and the big business model, and particularly the pharmaceutical model, whose dominance of the medical system is absolutely systemic. They've captured the agencies, the regulatory bodies, the industry, the politicians, the journals, the medical schools, the insurance industry. Everything is dominated by pharmaceutical interests, which suppose that health comes from drugs. It doesn't. It comes from lifestyle choices. It comes from living in harmony with nature. And this enables us to maintain our health and indeed our natural immunity, which is currently being denied by the NIH and the CDC. It's a very detailed subject, but it's a crucial part of what we're currently undergoing. And then we've got the relationship between the origins of where we are at the moment to the dual use gain of function research conducted by the US and China and funded by the US taxpayer. By dual use, I mean military and civilian. And this enabled the whole thing to get out of control. And where we are at the moment is a result of us thinking that we should be doing research in making viruses more lethal and infective. I mean, are we completely bonkers, completely mad? It's really extraordinary. So in my view, we should all be telling our world leaders, we don't want bioweapons research. We don't want gain of function. We want technologies to support life rather than generate the capacity for death. And then we're told there's only the vaccination. There's vaccination or nothing. So you go to your doctor and the doctor sends you back, waits till you get more ill, then you have to be hospitalized. And what's happened, as I'm sure you're aware, is that natural treatments and repurposed drugs like ivermectin have been forbidden. And there's a video by Dr. Paul Marek, who's an ICU physician, which I watched yesterday, who was using successfully ivermectin in a protocol to treat his patients, and they lived. And he was told by his hospital he was not allowed to do this anymore, and he had to watch his patients die. And so he's issued a lawsuit. And so I think we're at a crucial moment in this whole cycle. And the trusted news network, which is what all the mainstream outlets are part of, they censor any news that is, or any viewpoint that is not the mainstream narrative. And I think we're in a really sort of evolutionary challenge situation here, because we're edging down the road of technocracy, which is rule of technology, and leading to digital dictatorship and complete wipeout of all the 18th century Enlightenment values. And I recommend that you support, this is my own view, of course, the Alliance for Natural Health International, Robert Kirk, and the World Council for Health, which is a new holistic health organization, which stands for natural health and promoting health rather than just managing disease. So all of this takes place within the rhythms of life. We are part of life. So there is creation and destruction, sowing and reaping, birth and death, reappearance, rebirth, appearance and disappearance. And the whole process of nature is cyclical. And so we need a science and an agriculture and a health system which actually understands this. Now I'm going to say a little bit about Beinsa Douno, Peter Dunoff, who many of you will be familiar with, because his approach to nature and culture is, I think, incredibly important in terms of our future. He argues that and perceives, indeed, like Peter, that nature is intelligent and alive, and life in the mountains, in the Rila Mountains, is a life in presence of the peaks and the lakes and the presences, and the witnessing of the sunrise, and the importance of pure water, and the symbolism of the spring, which both has to receive in order to give. So here's a picture of Peter Dunoff in the mountains in Bulgaria in the 1930s. And there's a new book that's just come out of Rila Lectures called The Royal Path of the Soul, which you can get on Amazon. And this is a photograph I took of the Urdini Lakes in 2017, where I had an incredible walk, an incredible one-day walk. And you can see these lakes in the distance, and you don't meet anybody. I met one or two people when I was on my way back, but down in this lake area, I didn't meet anyone. There were just a few horses. And so this is when you can really be in touch with nature and feel the power and presence. And this is a picture I took from the Mount of Prayer of the sunrise in the Rila Mountains, I think in 2014. And so this is the great symbol of the rising of consciousness, the rising of the sun within us, as other speakers have been talking about. And here is a picture from the 1930s with Peter Dunoff doing the liberation gesture. And it struck me this morning that this breaking of the chains is something that we are going to need to do in order to move to a higher level. So what are the principles? The principles, the three main principles: love, wisdom, and truth. And love is associated with the heart. Love is life for the whole, he said. Wisdom is associated with light and the mind, and truth with love and wisdom combined, bringing freedom. And freedom implies strength of the will. And so it's very important that we don't neglect the will and just concentrate on the mind and the heart, because in order for things to happen, we need action and the involvement of the will. And then the 5 principles representing the pentagram then continue: love, wisdom, truth, justice or equity, and virtue or goodness. And these bring peace and joy. So I think we have an opportunity, and this obviously is the concern of everybody here, to move into a cosmic spring rather than cosmic darkness. And this will be based on these principles of goodness, of justice, of higher noetic reason, of harmony, of fraternity, which is the missing part of liberté, égalité, fraternité. But now this is the time for this, and on freedom and cosmic love, not on enslavement. And he wrote this: love is necessary for the transformation of the world. It is the only force which can bring peace between the nations, each of which has a mission to accomplish on earth. Love is beginning to appear. Goodness, justice, and light will triumph. It is simply a question of time. Religions need to be purified, he said. They all contain, sorry, it shouldn't be called, they all contain something divine, but this has been obscured by the repeated addition of human conceptions, as we know. So all believers will have to get together and agree on one single principle to make love the basis of any and every belief. Love and brotherhood, that is the common basis. And this is really what this is the agenda. How do we transform the world into a world of love? And of course, we have to start by being that ourselves. And I'm going to end with a poem that I wrote after I visited the Anthropological Museum in Victoria in British Columbia. And this is deeply rooted, as the Braiding Sweetgrass says, in cultures of gratitude. The ancient rule is to take only what you need, but to take only that which is given. And so we are all in the circle and cycle of life. Now I'm just trying to see, I think I need to stop. I'm just going to stop share for the moment, and then that will allow me to open my poem and read it to you. So it's all in the same canoe, crafted from living trees in ancient forest, tended by countless generations, rooted in earth, connecting, caring, communing together, offering to share with open hearts, paddling in the same canoe together, then abruptly felled, cleared, extracted, rooted out by grabbers converting verbs to nouns, trees to lumber, minds to closed belief. So certain in intent, the rugged man paddles his own canoe alone, striving so hard to win the race. Tenacious to the last, he finally falters. Nature exhausted. A daunting insight slowly dawns. We're all in the same canoe together. Thank you.
Wow, David, thank you so much. Again, that's just such a good thing to hear. You know, when we all, I don't know about others, but feel we're struggling in a world we're not happy with, we'd love to change, and we don't seem to have the wherewithal to do so, but working together and with these concepts that you bring out so beautifully, I feel we have a chance, a very big chance. So thank you very much. Wonderful.